2012 Royal Society Winton Prize for Science Books. I'm Ben Miller, and I have to say it's an incredible honour to be here at the Royal Society hosting these awards. All I can say is rob, bride and eat your heart out. If you're sitting next to someone you shouldn't be, you may wish to know that tonight's awards are being recorded. Channel 4, ladies and gentlemen. You may also wish to put your phones on silent, just in case, during your acceptance speech, the person you should be sitting next to tries to track you down. We're here, of course, to celebrate the very best in science writing, writing which in turn celebrates the very best in science. And what a great year for science this has been. We finally found the Higgs particle, the particle that gives mass to the building blocks of matter. The discovery of the Higgs produced some wonderful quotes from the science community. Peter Knight, president of the British Institute of Physics, said, "This is the physics equivalent of the discovery of DNA." Science News said, "The Higgs has been physicists' version of King Arthur's Holy Grail, Ponce de Leon's Fountain of Youth, and Captain Ahab's Moby Dick." While German research minister Annette Schavan said, "The curiosity of researchers has been rewarded." Way to go, Annette. However, it was probably the science desk of Britain's tabloid The Daily Mail who summed the whole thing up best with, "Higgs particle may give you cancer." Just kidding, they actually said it was heart disease. This was the year that Discovery landed on Mars, looked for signs of life. In fact, rumors are rife that Discovery will soon announce that it's detected methane on the red planet, which is going to be tough for the Martians as they have no dogs to blame it on. Felix Baumgartner, sponsored by Red Bull, jumped to Earth from space. His next feat, sponsored by Horlicks, will be climbing into a warm bath without elbow testing it first. Mind you, thank you, all these glorious achievements could be in vain, since according to the very unscientific Mayan prophecy, the world is predicted to end in December, on December the 21st, to be precise. So on the downside, we're all going to be plasmalized by a cataclysmic fireball. On the plus side, it's really taken the stress out of Christmas. Yes, it's been a great year for science and a great year for science books. The very best popular science writing is literature at its most thought-provoking, transformative, and outright beautiful. The shortlisted works for this year's Royal Society Winton Prize for Science Books are all masterpieces of the genre, not only teaching us some truly enthralling science, but also helping us reimagine the boundaries of what a science book can be. The Royal Society, as the world's oldest scientific academy, is delighted to host this award and thereby encourage the writing, publishing, and reading of outstanding popular science books. And we're extremely grateful to Winton Capital Management for their generous support. This year's panel were Jasper Fforde, author of the Thursday Next novels and the Last Dragonslayer series, Tanya Hirschman, author of short story collections, writer in residence at the University of Bristol and founder and editor of The Short Review, Kim Schillinglaw, BBC commissioning editor for Science and Natural History, Dr. Samuel Turvey, Royal Society University Research Fellow at the Institute of Zoology, and Professor Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, DBE FRS, and visiting professor at the Department of Astrophysics at the University of Oxford. Now, before we announce the winner of this year's prize, we'll be treated to a reading by the author of each shortlisted book. We'll then have a brief panel discussion before opening up questions to the floor. We shall then put our 6 brilliant shortlisted authors out of their misery and find out the winner of this year's prize. I should add, actually, at that point, we will go live to Channel 4 for our prize-winning author to be interviewed. So that's going to be interesting. There's a schedule, let me put it that way. Now let's hear from our 6 shortlisted authors. The first book we'll hear from tonight is Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer.
That's it?
That's it?
Okay. That's interesting. Okay. I'm actually really fortunate to have the main character in my book, besides myself, Ed Cook, here tonight. He's become a dear friend of mine, and he asked me specifically not to read a section that involves him. Fair enough. So I'm going to be reading about a character called EP, who had perhaps the worst memory in the world. Certainly in the medical literature, there are few like him. I'm curious to see EP's unconscious, non-declarative memory at work. So I ask him if he's interested in taking me on a walk around his neighborhood. He says, not really. So I wait and ask him again a couple minutes later. This time he agrees. We walk out the front door into the high afternoon sun and turn right. His decision, not mine. I ask EP why we're not turning to the left instead. I'd just rather not go that way. This is just the way I go. I don't know why, he says. If I asked him to draw a map of the route he takes at least 3 times a day, he'd never be able to do it. He doesn't even know his own address, or almost as improbably for someone from San Diego, which way the ocean is. But after so many years of taking the same walk, the journey has etched itself onto his unconscious. His wife, Beverly, now lets him go out alone, even though a single wrong turn would leave him completely lost. Sometimes he comes back from his walks with objects he's picked up along the way, a stack of round stones, a puppy, somebody's wallet. He can never explain how they came into his possession. Our neighbors love him because he'll come up to them and just start talking to them, Beverly tells me. Even though he thinks he's meeting them for the first time, he's learned through force of nature, force of habit, that these are people he should feel comfortable with. And he interprets those unconscious feelings of comfort as a good reason to stop and say hello. That EP has learned to like his neighbors without ever learning who they are points to how many of our basic day-to-day actions are guided by implicit values and judgments, independent of declarative memory. I wonder what other things EP has learned through force of habit. What other non-declarative memories have continued to shape him over the decade and a half since he lost his declarative memory? Surely he must still have desires and fears, emotions and cravings, even if his conscious recollection of those feelings is so fleeting that he cannot recognize them for long enough to verbalize them. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Even if we are at the mercy of our memories in establishing our identities, it is clear that EP is much more than just a soulless golem. Excuse me. In spite of everything he's lost, there is still a person there, and a personality, a charming personality, in fact, with a unique perspective on the world. Even if a virus wiped clean his memories, it didn't completely wipe clean his personhood. It just left a hollow, static self that can never grow and can never change. We cross the street and walk away from Beverly and Carol, leaving me alone with EP for the first time. He doesn't know who I am or what I'm doing at his side, although he seems to sense that I'm there for some good reason. He looks at me and purses his lips, and I can see that he's searching for something to say. Rather than try to fill the empty silence, I let it linger for a moment to see where the discomfort might lead. I guess I'm hoping for some fleeting recognition of how odd it all must be, this scene without a prologue. But no such recognition comes, or if it does, EP never lets it surface. He is trapped, I realize, in the ultimate existential nightmare, utterly blind to the reality in which he lives. The impulse strikes me to help him escape, at least for a second. I want to take him by the arm and shake him. You have a rare and debilitating memory disorder, I want to tell him. The last 50 years have been lost to you. In less than a minute, you're going to forget that this conversation ever even happened. I imagine the horror that would descend upon him, the momentary clarity, the gaping emptiness that would open up in front of him and close just as quickly, and then the passing car or the singing bird that would snap him back into his oblivious bubble. But of course I don't do it. We've gone far enough, I tell him, and point him in the direction from which we came. We turn around and walk back down the street, whose name he's forgotten, past the waving neighbors he doesn't recognize, to a home he doesn't know. In front of the house sits a car with tinted windows. We turn to look at our reflections. I ask EP what he sees. An old man, he says. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joshua. The next shortlisted book we'll hear from is My Beautiful Genome by Lona Frank.
Just like Joshua, I'm so lucky to have the main character of my book here. It's me. And I'd like to read a little bit from the prologue of the book called My Accidental Biology. I'm dead tired. For the last hour and a half, I've been run through a battery of tests, all designed to shed some light on my personality, my disposition, and my intellectual abilities. I volunteered to take part in a major research project to examine the connection between specific genes and personality, in particular, a tendency towards depression. We finally reached the last questionnaire. A young female researcher is gazing cheerily at me from across the table. I'd like to ask you some questions about your immediate family, having to do with drug and alcohol abuse, criminality, and psychological illness. Her perky blonde ponytail sways back and forth, and it makes her look especially efficient. They're not about you, but about your first-degree relatives, your parents, siblings, and children. I don't have any children. Well, you parents and siblings, then. My parents are dead, but I have a brother. Whether they're alive or not doesn't matter. The questions are the same, she says. Let's start with alcohol. Have any of your first-degree relatives had any problem with alcohol? Problem, you say. Yeah, well, I suppose I'd have to say yes to that, such as it is. Yes? My father. Some would say he had a certain problem with alcohol. Starting your day with vodka in your coffee and working your way through with malt liquor might be called by some people a bit of a problem. For an extended period, she asks. As long as I can remember, really. But he didn't think it was a problem himself as such. He could certainly function. She flips the first page of the questionnaire, following the instructions. Did this alcohol abuse ever lead to divorce or separation? Yes. She looks at me inquisitively, inviting additional information. 3 times divorce. The eyebrows shoot up her forehead. But then she resumes the interrogation with a more optimistic tone. Have any of your first-degree relatives had any mental health problems? Yes, I say without hesitation. I'm asked to identify which ones. All of them. She mumbles to herself, leafing through her papers confused. All of them? Okay, where do we start? I want to be helpful, so I quickly run down the list. When I was little, my mother suffered from depression, deep clinical depression, which was particularly bad in her last few years. My younger brother has had a few bouts of his own, and my father was manic depressive, diagnosed at 60, by which time the disease had come to be known as bipolar disorder. He had manic phases, she asked. I'd have to say yes. I flash back to that one Christmas when he essentially did not sleep for a week, but trudged around the house clutching a Stone Age axe in one hand and his well-worn Bible in the other, talking and talking and talking, becoming more and more incoherent. Finally, we had to hospitalize him. Has anyone other than your father had psychiatric treatment? We all have. Medication or consultations with a psychiatrist? Both, I say. Then something comes to me. What about suicide attempts? Do they count? The young researcher nods silently and locates the box on the questionnaire for suicide attempts. There were 2 of them, 2 that I know of anyway. Both were made by my father. My mother, on the other hand, talked about it but never tried it. The researcher stares resolutely at her papers as she turns to the final questions. About alcohol, she continues. I also have to ask you about yourself. How many drinks do you have during the course of a week? It must be about 14, I lie promptly and deftly. For some reason, 20 or a bit more doesn't sound good, and my intention is always to stick to 14. You know, 2 glasses of red wine a day, purely for medicinal purposes. It's because red wine contains resveratrol, which is very healthy for pretty much anything, heart, blood pressure, cognitive faculties. She nods enthusiastically. 14 drinks, that's within the National Board of Health recommendations. Good, good, she says at last, displaying an almost liberated smile. Yes, well, I don't think I have any more questions. But I do. I have questions. They've been smoldering quietly in my mind as we progressed from question to question. They were probably the real reason I volunteered to be part of this genetic study. If I'm to be honest, there's a direct connection between my interrogation today in a nondescript scientist's office and the hospital room at the other end of the country where I held my father's hand as he died on a summer's day a year earlier. Because what's an interest in genetic information about? It's about your heritage, your history, your identity.
Thank you, Lorna. The next author reading is from The Information by James Glick.
I'm just going to read a snippet from the middle. It probably needs some introduction, but it's not going to get any. all that information capacity looms over us, not quite visible, not quite tangible, but awfully real, amorphous, spectral, hovering nearby, yet not situated in any one place. Heaven must have once felt this way to the faithful. People talk about shifting their lives to the cloud, their informational lives at least. You may store photographs in the cloud. Google will manage your business in the cloud. Google's putting all the world's books into the cloud. Email passes to and from the cloud and never really leaves the cloud. All traditional ideas of privacy based on doors and locks, physical remoteness and invisibility are upended in the cloud. Money lives in the cloud. The old forms are vestigial tokens of knowledge about who owns what, who owes what. To the 21st century, these will be seen as anachronisms, quaint, or even absurd. Bullion carried from shore to shore in fragile ships, subject to the tariffs of pirates and the god Poseidon. Metal coins tossed from moving cars into baskets at highway toll gates and thereafter trucked about. And now the history of your automobile is in the cloud. Paper checks torn from pads and signed in ink, tickets for trains, performances, air travel, or anything at all printed on weighty perforated paper with watermarks, holograms, or fluorescent fibers, and soon enough, all forms of cash. The economy of the world is transacted in the cloud. Its physical aspect couldn't be less cloud-like. Server farms proliferate in unmarked brick buildings and steel complexes with smoked windows or no windows, miles of hollow floors, diesel generators, cooling towers, 7-foot intake fans, and aluminum chimney stacks. This hidden infrastructure grows in a symbiotic relationship with the electrical infrastructure it is increasingly resembling. There are information switchers, control centers, and substations. They are clustered and distributed. These are the wheelworks. The cloud is their avatar.
Thank you, James. The next shortlisted book we'll hear from is The Hidden Reality by Brian Greene.
Fantastic, a cosmic bubble bath. Beautiful. My book, The Hidden Reality, is about the possibility of other universes, parallel worlds. And that's a strange idea to most people because most of us were raised to think that the universe is everything. And I say most of us with a degree of forethought. As is my daughter, she's now 5, but when she was 3 and a half, she had heard me talk about these ideas since basically she was born. And one day I was holding her and I said, "Sophia, I love you more than anything in the universe." And she turned to me and said, "Daddy, universe or multiverse?" But barring such an anomalous upbringing, a book on this subject has to give you some sense for why scientists would consider such a strange possibility that there might be other universes. And the book goes through basically how a lot of mathematical clues from our studies of the laws of physics suggest this possibility. By no means establish it or secure it, but at least suggest it as a possibility. So what I'd like to do is read you a little section from the end of the book after I've gone through the arguments from mathematical reasoning why this idea should be taken seriously, and I ask the question, should we believe mathematics? Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg once wrote, "Our mistake is not that we take our theories too seriously, but that we do not take them seriously enough. It is always hard to realize that these numbers and equations we play with at our desks have something to do with the real world." Now, to be sure, Weinberg's remark has to be applied with care. In the absence of compelling experimental or observational results, deciding which mathematics should be taken seriously is as much art as it is science. But centuries of discovery have made it abundantly evident that monumental upheavals in physics have emerged time and again from vigorously following mathematics' lead. Einstein's own complex dance with mathematics provides a revealing case study. In the late 1800s, when James Clerk Maxwell realized that light was an electromagnetic wave, his equations showed that light speed should be about 300,000 kilometers per second. But a nagging loose end was that his equations left unanswered the question, 300,000 kilometers per second relative to what? Scientists pursued the makeshift resolution that an invisible substance permeating space, the ether, provided the unseen standard of rest. By the early 20th century, Einstein argued that scientists needed to take Maxwell's mathematics more seriously. If Maxwell's equations didn't refer to a standard of rest, then there was no need for a standard of rest. Light speed, Einstein forcefully declared, is 300,000 kilometers per second relative to anything. And with that move, Einstein broke through to the special theory of relativity, overturning centuries of thought regarding space, time, matter, and energy. During the next decade, in the course of developing the general theory of relativity, Einstein became intimately familiar with vast areas of math that most physicists of his day knew little or nothing about. As he groped toward general relativity's final equations, Einstein displayed a master's skill in molding these mathematical constructs with the firm hand of physical intuition. A few years later, when he received the good news that observations during the 1919 solar eclipse confirmed general relativity, Einstein confidently noted that had the results been different, quote, he would have been sorry for the dear Lord, since the theory is correct. Now, I'm sure that convincing data contravening general relativity would have changed Einstein's tune, but the remark captures well how a set of mathematical equations, through their sleek internal logic, through their intrinsic beauty, through their potential for wide-ranging applicability, can seemingly radiate reality. Nevertheless, there was a limit to how far Einstein was willing to follow his own mathematics. Einstein did not take the general theory of relativity seriously enough to believe its prediction of black holes or the Big Bang, things that have been subsequently confirmed. So we learn that even Einstein, at various times in his life, made the wrong decision regarding which equations to take seriously and which to not. The multiverse theories we've discussed owe their genesis to numbers and equations played with by theorists sitting at desks, scribbling in notebooks, and writing on chalkboards and programming computers. Whether invoking general relativity, quantum mechanics, or string theory, these multiverse proposals only arise because we assume that mathematical theorizing can guide us toward hidden truths. Only time will tell if this assumption takes the underlying mathematical theories too seriously, or perhaps not seriously enough. If some or all of the mathematics that has compelled us to think about parallel worlds prove relevant to reality, Einstein's famous query, asking whether the universe has the properties it does simply because no other universe is possible, would have a definite answer. No. Our universe would not be the only possible universe. Its properties could have been different, and in many of the other universes, the properties would be different. In turn, seeking a fundamental explanation for why certain things are the way they are would be pointless. Instead, statistical likelihood or plain happenstance would be firmly inserted in our understanding of a cosmos that would be profoundly vast. I don't know if this is how things will turn out. No one does. But it's only through fearless engagement that we can learn our own limits. It's only through the rational pursuit of theories, even those that whisk us into strange and unfamiliar domains, that we stand a chance of revealing the hidden reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. The next shortlisted book we'll hear from is The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker.
From the preface. Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has declined over long stretches of time, and today we may be living in the most peaceable era in our species' existence. The decline, to be sure, has not been smooth. It has not brought rates of violence down to zero, and it is not guaranteed to continue. But it is an unmistakable development, visible on scales from millennia to years, from the waging of wars to the spanking of children. No aspect of life is untouched by the retreat from violence. Daily existence is very different if you always have to worry about being abducted, raped, or killed, and it's hard to develop sophisticated arts, learning, or commerce if the institutions that support them are looted and burned as quickly as they are built. The historical trajectory of violence affects not only how life is lived, but how it is understood. What could be more fundamental to our sense of meaning and purpose than a conception of whether the strivings of the human race over long stretches of time have left us better or worse off? How, in particular, are we to make sense of modernity, of the erosion of family, tribe, tradition, and religion by the forces of individualism, cosmopolitanism, reason, and science? So much depends on how we understand the legacy of this transition. Whether we see our world as a nightmare of crime, terrorism, genocide, and war, or as a period that by the standards of history is blessed by unprecedented levels of peaceful coexistence. The question of whether the arithmetic sign of trends in violence is positive or negative also bears on our conception of human nature. Though theories of human nature rooted in biology are often associated with fatalism about violence, and the theory that the mind is a blank slate is associated with progress, in my view, the connection goes the other way. How are we to understand the natural state of life when our species first emerged and the processes of history began? The belief that violence has increased suggests that the world we made has contaminated us, perhaps irretrievably. The belief that it has decreased suggests that we started off nasty and that the artifices of civilization have moved us in a noble direction, one in which we can hope to continue. First, I have to convince you that violence really has gone down over the course of history, knowing that the very idea invites skepticism, incredulity, and sometimes anger. Our cognitive faculties predispose us to believe that we live in violent times, especially when they are stoked by media that follow the watchword, "If it bleeds, it leads." The human mind tends to estimate the probability of an event from the ease with which it can recall examples, and scenes of carnage are more likely to be beamed into our homes and burned into our memories than footage of people dying of old age. No matter how small the percentage of violent deaths may be, in absolute numbers, there will always be enough of them to fill the evening news, so people's impressions of violence will be disconnected from the actual proportions. As one becomes aware of the decline of violence, the world begins to look different. The past seems less innocent, the present less sinister. One starts to appreciate the small gifts of coexistence that would have seemed utopian to our ancestors. The interracial family playing in the park, the comedian who lands a zinger on the commander-in-chief, the countries that quietly back away from a crisis instead of escalating to war. This shift is not toward complacency. We enjoy the peace we find today because people in past generations were appalled by the violence in their time and worked to reduce it, and so we should work to reduce the violence that remains in our time. Indeed, it is a recognition of the decline of violence that best affirms that such efforts are worthwhile. Man's inhumanity to man has long been a subject for moralization. With the knowledge that something has driven it down, we can also treat it as a matter of cause and effect. Instead of asking, why is there war, we might ask, why is there peace? We can obsess not just over what we have been doing wrong, but also over what we have been doing right. Because we have been doing something right, and it would be good to know what exactly it is.
Thank you, Stephen. Unfortunately, Nathan Wolfe can't be here tonight to read from his book, The Viral Storm, but he did film this short video for us.
I'm Nathan Wolfe, and I'm a microbiologist based in San Francisco. And the book that I wrote that's been nominated for the Royal Society Winton Prize is The Viral Storm. And it was a book that I wrote really about sort of the nature of pandemics, the sort of natural history. Why do we have pandemics? What's the sort of history of the pandemics that we've experienced as a species? But also, what's the nature of how humans are changing and how we've changed over the last couple of thousand years? And how does this influence the susceptibility that we have to these pandemics? And then finally, what are some of the sort of novel approaches we're going to have to use if we're going to be able to get ahead of some of these pandemic problems that we're experiencing? I'm very sorry that I couldn't join tonight for the Royal Society's Winton Prize awards. It's a great honor to be sort of included in the short list of individuals who were nominated for this prize, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be able to join you this evening. Located in the west of the country near the border of Burma, Pangtruk is home to about 3,000 people whose livelihoods depend on the sugar and rice they grow. In December of 2003, it was also home to Captain Bunmanuch, a 6-year-old boy who would be among the first people to die of a brand new human virus. Captain loved riding his bicycle, climbing trees, and playing with his plastic toy Dalmatian that pulled 3 puppies in tiny brown wagons as it barked mechanically. Captain also enjoyed helping his family on the farm. Nearly every family in Pangtruk kept egg-laying chickens. Some also kept roosters for cockfighting. That winter, as on many farms in this region, chickens in Captain Uncle's farm suffered from severe diarrhea, strange behavior, and weakness. A day or two before the new year, according to reports, the boy carried one of the 6 walking chickens home. That walk home would have lasted no more than a few minutes. A few days later, Captain grew feverish. A clinic in the village diagnosed him with a cold, but after 3 days without improvement, his father, Chamnan, a rice farmer who worked part-time as a driver, took him to a public hospital. More detailed testing using a molecular technique called the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, revealed that Captain was likely infected with an atypical type of influenza, perhaps one not yet seen or widely seen in humans. After 11 days of illness, the boy's fever finally began to cool off. However, despite intensive care, his respiratory distress worsened. Just before midnight on January 25th, physicians took Captain off the respirator, his lungs drowning in fluids. He became Thailand's first known death from H5N1, which would soon become known around the world as bird flu.
Thank you, Joshua. And I'd also like to thank the students of the London College of Communication and Central St Martin's College of Art and Design for those outstanding films. I'd now like to invite all the shortlisted authors to join me on stage for our panel discussion. Please welcome again Joshua Foer, Lona Frank, James Glick, Brian Green, and Stephen Pinker. Hello. Hi. So, Joshua, if I might start with you. In your book, Moonwalking with Einstein, you learn the art of memory training. In fact, using the techniques you learned, you became a finalist in the US Memory Championship. The question I suppose I want to ask is memory really something that anyone can learn, even a sort of 46-year-old comedian?
First of all, I won the championship. You can give away the punchline. It's okay. But okay, what you're asking is actually what do we mean when we talk about memory? Because we all learn our memories to a certain extent. What I studied in the process of reporting this book are a set of techniques that were invented in antiquity and which can be used in certain, actually fairly limited domains to give your memory an advantage. Essentially, you're figuring out, you're using tricks to make otherwise unmemorable pieces of information memorable. I am utterly convinced that anybody can learn how to do this, and that it's not a particularly freakish ability.
Are you sure you're not just brilliant at remembering things? I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement, surely, to, as you say, I was trying hard not to give it away, but you actually won the competition. So do you think that was as a result of your training or because of an aptitude? Or?
It was the result of a couple things. One of the things it was a result of is the fact this guy, Ed Cook, who's sitting here in the audience, took me under his wings and taught me all of these techniques and was essentially my coach for a year. And when I came to compete in the US Memory Championship, I was armed to the teeth with all of these memory tricks which had been essentially developed in Europe, where this whole sport of competitive memory is much more advanced than it is in America. So not to belittle my accomplishment, but I came, with the European Union at my back, and this is the one this is like the Ryder Cup of memory. Americans are just sort of a step below our European colleagues.
I beg to differ. I think it's tremendously impressive. And Lona, can I ask you about your book? In My Beautiful Genome, you investigate this new world of genomics, personal genomics, where we can sequence our DNA and supposedly learn all kinds of things about ourselves and our heritage. How did this journey change your own view of yourself, or didn't it?
It didn't completely alter it, of course. I mean, I'm still the person I used to be. But it really, the most interesting thing to me was going into behavioral genetics. A lot of people think about consumer genomics as something to do with learning whether you have, a high risk of heart disease or Alzheimer or whatever. But I quickly sort of got that over and, found out some disease risks, and that's all good. But the interesting thing was going into behavioral genetics and seeing what is really there. Because when you ask most people, so, does genetics play a part in who you are, in your, psychology? A lot of people will say, no. Genetics has something to do with, how we look and whether we are, become ill or not, but has nothing to do with who we are. And of course, it turns out when you look into the research, it has an awful lot to do with who we are. Our personality traits are very heritable, and there are even, a certain number of genes that we can start to look at how they affect the way our brains react to, the world, and then why we are the way we are.
So forgive my ignorance, but there are certain alleles, are there, which are directly related to certain personality traits? Could you give an example of that, or Well, there are
genetic variants that have to do with the with serotonin, the signal molecule serotonin, and with dopamine, for example, and the way that those are turned over in the brain have to do with your temperament, or it leaves a mark on your temperament. Are you more neurotic? Are you more prone to depression and so on? And as everybody heard, I have a certain history with depression in my family. And I had always thought that that was probably just because of a lousy upbringing. And, my father was drinking and so forth, and my mother died early. But it probably also has a lot to do with lousy genes, I found out.
If you could, would you wish to alter your own genome to affect your personality? Is that something?
No, I'd probably like to alter my childhood.
Yeah.
I'm
with you on that.
No,
Yeah.
I'm fine with my genome.
James. James Glick, your book, The Information, offers a fascinating history of how humanity stored, used, and communicated information. And the book has, for me, a very intriguing subtitle. The subtitle is A History, a Theory, a Flood. What does that subtitle mean to you?
The subtitle didn't occur to me until I was almost done with the book, and I realized the book doesn't exactly have 3 parts, but there is a history, a theory, and I realized that we were heading toward the flood. I wrote the book because the core of the book is a piece of science, that is the theory, what scientists refer to as information theory, which I personally found really interesting. I stumbled upon it when I was working on my first book, Chaos, which was 20 years ago. There were chaos guys who were using information theory to explore purely physical systems, and that just in itself struck me as weird and really cool. Meanwhile, we have lived through what everybody keeps telling us is the information age. I mean, did you know that today is apparently Cyber Monday? Yeah, see? It's so.
What does that mean, Cyber Monday?
Don't make me explain that. It's something to do with shopping, I think.
Right. Oh, okay.
I didn't make that up. Google it after we're done. The point is, I felt there was a connection between the science and the world we're living in. I mean, that was my starting point. But as I was writing the book, and as we've lived through this world, we could see that our destiny seemed to be a paradoxical thing for which we often use the metaphor flood. The paradox being, we live for information, we love information. Information is the thing that makes us special as a species, and yet we are anxious about it. We feel there is too much of it. We feel we're drowning in it.
And as a result of this flood, of information, are we losing our grip on knowledge?
Well, that's the worry, isn't it? I mean, we have devices in our pocket that let us instantly get an answer to just about any question, and yet I feel we don't necessarily think of ourselves as especially smarter.
And Google has changed the whole the whole hierarchy of information, hasn't it? Simply by its connectivity, or is an extraordinary. The value of information seems to be changing. Where do you see this heading?
Well, Google is a great tool. It's a response to these conditions. Google and Wikipedia and the social media and all the rest, I see these as our part of the continuing, I emphasize continuing because they are not new, human effort to search and filter the welter of information around us. And they ought to be making us more conscious than ever that information is not the same as knowledge, much less wisdom. As for where we're heading, human history has never reached a point where we all collectively said, okay, we've got enough information now, let's stop.
Well, in my search for knowledge, I'll now turn to Brian Greene. Your book, The Hidden Reality, tackles what, to my knowledge, is a little explored branch of quantum mechanics, certainly in mainstream science, called multiverse theory. Firstly, can you describe what we mean by multiverse theory? And secondly, why do you think the theory, as attractive as it is so largely ignored?
Well, so what a multiverse proposal is, it's any of a series of proposals that are distinct in details that would tell us that what we have thought to be everything, the stars, the galaxies, everything you see in the observable universe, is not all there is. That there's much, much more to the expanse of reality than what we have long thought. And what else might be out there depends in detail which proposal one is talking about. There's some versions of multiverse proposals where literally mathematically you can establish with certain very minimal assumptions that we are out there having this conversation 100, 1,000, perhaps infinitely many times in distinct realms in a much wider reality. And in some of those realms, we are in interchange chairs, and I'm the comedian, and you're the physicist.
That is a scary thought.
It is a scary thought. You know, I was lecturing about this when I was on book tour, and when I mentioned that idea, some woman in the front row raised her hand and said, does that mean there's a reality where Sarah Palin is president? And I'm not a political person, so I really don't know how to respond, but some guy in the back raises his hand and says, didn't you hear the professor? The reality has to be compatible with the laws of physics. But quantum mechanics suggests many different realms where the different ways that a quantum system can evolve, all possibilities are realized. There are ones where there are multiple Big Bangs. The Big Bang that gave rise to our universe might have been not a unique event. Many Big Bangs, many universes. And that's the basic subject that multiverse theory explores.
And why do you think it's not really gained traction? Is it because you can't do experiments on it? Is it because...
Well, it all depends what you mean by gain traction. You know, in popular culture, there's a lot of people who explore this in films and fiction. But as far as the scientific community goes, this is a highly controversial subject. There are people, serious, solid people who study this, but it's controversial for that reason. You can't observe these other realms, typically. You can't taste them. You can't touch them. You can't visit them. So are you doing science? And one of the things I discussed in the book is I think you are doing science, because if you look at the various proposals in detail, at least in some of them, there's at least a chance that we could, in the far future, gain observational evidence that these other realms are there. It's difficult. It's something that we should not hold our breath about, but science should not be limited to the things that we can test today.
Fascinating. Thank you. Stephen, if I could just turn to you. Your book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is an account of human violence through the ages, as you described. And you show that far from increasing, as one might expect, human violence has actually decreased. Are you saying that there's a cultural pressure towards diminishing violence, or an evolutionary pressure? Are you saying, or is a cultural pressure causing an evolutionary pressure? What's the driving force behind this?
The forces I explore in the book are cultural, although I do examine the possibility that there's been literal biological evolution in the technical sense of a change in our genome over the generations. But we know that some of the changes that I write about could not possibly be genetic because they just happened too quickly and too recently. For example, the decline of interstate war since 1945. There have only been a couple of generations since then, and natural selection has a speed limit measured in generations. So given that we know that some of the changes can't be genetic, I adopt the simplifying assumption that none of them are genetic, while not ruling it out dogmatically.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the conventional assumption is that when you're into a sort of a recession, you start a war. Yeah. But you seem to be saying that actually commercial pressure would wish for less violence. Is that the?
Well, it's certainly true that the common impression that economic friction and hardship inevitably leads to violence is mistaken. And an example is the Great Recession of the last 3 years, in which everyone predicted that the violent crime rate would go up in response, and in fact it's gone down. Likewise, it's often the rich countries that can afford the luxury of big conquering armies, and they're not necessarily under any particular economic stress to go out and conquer. It's just that they can afford to do it, and it's much more the intention than the financial straits that make the difference. It is, for similar reasons, true that that countries that do engage in greater degrees of trade have less of an incentive to go to war. For one thing, the guy in the other country is more valuable to you alive than dead if you're buying and selling stuff. And for another, it just becomes cheaper to buy stuff than to steal it if you're in a trading relationship. And so the old Enlightenment idea of du commerce, gentle commerce, seems to be vindicated by the statistical studies that correlate trading relations with a lower degree of falling into war.
Well, I have to say, it does feel to me like good news, and it's tremendously welcome. We have an opportunity now just to have briefly invite some questions from the floor for the panel. If you could just wait until the microphone reaches you. I think there's a gentleman back there who'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks a lot. My name is Heider from Bain & Company. My question was for Mr. Pimker. So I completely agree, actually, that violence has seen a huge decline. What I was wondering was why you chose to write your book about violence specifically. Because I think, for example, knowledge has also seen a very steep increase. Health has also seen a very steep increase. Poverty has seen a decrease. So there are a lot of these topics which have seen a very positive evolution over the years. You chose to write specifically about violence. So why is that? And do you think that, like, which of these is actually the cause of the other improvements? Is it because we are more free that we get more knowledge, we are less violent, or is it because we are less violent that we get more free and we get more knowledge, etc., etc.? Thank you.
Well, I chose to focus on violence for two reasons. One of them intellectual, namely, if you're interested in human nature, as I am, it's a natural concern. And for centuries, we've been having a debate over whether humans harbor any violent impulses, and if they do, does that doom us to perpetual war? And my intuition has always been we do harbor some violent impulses, but we harbor lots of other stuff as well. The mind is a big, complicated place with lots of different subsystems. Some of them, like revenge and dominance, can push us toward violence. But others, like self-control and reason and empathy, can pull us back from violence. And it's a question of which of those components of the mind are engaged in a particular time and place. So I came to it as a psychologist, interested in the different components of the mind that interact to produce or inhibit violence. But also in the course of studying the psychology of violence, I kept coming across these statistics that people seem to be unaware of, showing that there really have been historical declines. The fact that rates of homicide in Britain are perhaps 1/35 of what they were during the Middle Ages. The fact that many foraging groups, hunter-gatherers, tribalists, hunter-horticulturalists, have rates of death in warfare that dwarf even those of our world wars. All of these facts seem to me to be of profound importance, and moreover, no one seemed to know about them. I wrote a short internet posting mentioning some of them, and then I got a flood of correspondence from quantitative historians, from international relations scholars, from people who track rates of child abuse and spousal abuse, all of them saying, oh, by the way, there's even more evidence for historical declines than you mentioned in that posting. Then I realized that there's an important story that needs to get out, that the trend seems to be more or less downward, and that this bears on the psychological question of what ramps the tendency toward violence up or down.
Thank you. I think we've just got time for one more quick question from the floor, if anybody has a question. Gentleman in the back there.
This is for any of the panelists who care to run with it. You're all involved in a profession of explaining complex ideas to the public. Do you think the gap between what scientists know and what the average citizen is aware of is getting greater?
Very short answer, yes.
The gap between what scientists know and what scientists know is getting greater. Something we were talking about earlier, that, you know, Stephen may be one of the greatest cognitive scientists of his generation, but he can't explain most of what the average particle physicist does on a daily basis. And if you were to go back to the days of the founding of this society, most of the people who were members were at least able to wrap their minds around what was going on in sort of all of the sciences. You could really at least have a pretense of knowing everything, and that's obviously far from the case today.
What a great question, and I'm going to say no, just to be difficult. I mean, yes, I think that's exactly right. That the gap between what I'm able to understand and what, let's say, Brian is able to understand is probably greater than the gap between the average resident of England in 1700 and what was contained in Newton's Principia. But I believe that the spread of scientific knowledge has clearly never been greater than it is now. That scientific knowledge of all kinds is available to billions of people in a way that has never been true in human history. So in that sense, I'd like to say no. The gap between us and even the most obscure scientists is maybe closing.
But isn't it the fact that there's an awful lot of information out there, but there's not always very much knowledge?
There we go again. And on that bombshell, I'm afraid we're going to have to call a halt there to the discussion. Thank you so much to everyone who asked questions, and please thank our panel once more, our shortlisted authors. Thank you. You'd like to return to your seats. As the shortlisted authors return to their seats, we get to the real meat of the evening. To find out who's won and why, please welcome Paul Nurse, President of the Royal Society, and David Harding, founder of Winton Capital Management.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see such a turnout. The first thing I want to say, really, is to thank Ben for being such a great chair and for investing it with such humour and wit, just as one would expect.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Now, there is great writing in science. I had to think of the person who many would say has been the greatest biologist of all time, Charles Darwin. If you read Origin of Species, if you read those last paragraphs of The Origin of Species, it is beautiful, beautiful writing. But I really think that we've seen a renaissance in science writing in the last decades. And this has led, I think, to a real increase in the standards of writing, in the ability of that writing to excite the reader, to engage the reader in science. And I think it's fantastic that what I've seen in the last several decades of my working life. And these 6 books here on the short list are all great contributors to this improved tradition. It's really a pity that somebody's got to win, to be perfectly honest, because what we have here are great contributors to the art of science writing, and it is critical for us to excite our public, especially our young public, and for that matter to engage our public because of the importance science will play in our society. So that was my few comments that I wanted to make about this very important prize. And we are now going to the announcement. Now, I've been told reliably that there is indeed something here. So we have a trophy, and we have 2 envelopes. One envelope I'm giving to David because he was the one who wrote it, okay? And in this envelope, this is the envelope, we have the Royal Society Winton Prize for Science Books 2012 winner. This is a pregnant pause. I don't know who it is.
I do.
Well, of course you do. But I don't, all right? The winner of the 2012 Royal Society Winton Prize for Science Books is James Glick for The Information.
Thank you.
Congratulations, well done. I finished it today, it's great.
Many, many congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if you want to say just a few words.
That's a very unexpected surprise. Just to share a stage with Joshua Foer, Lona Frank, Brian Greene, and Steve Pinker has been a great honor. Thanks to all of you for your inspiring work. It is a thrill to be at the Royal Society. I first came here a dozen years ago when I was working on my biography of Isaac Newton, and the librarians here were extremely generous to me. Let me thank them again and the entire society. Thank you, people of Winton, for supporting this prize. Science, and I want to particularly thank my agent, Georgina Capel, and my editor, Nicholas Pearson. And even more inspiring and helpful than they have been, my wife, Cynthia Crossan. Science writing is a peculiar category, I think, because many of the people who practice it are scientists writing about their own wonderful work. I'm in the other category, the category of people who are on the outside with their faces pressed against the glass. So I guess my main thanks have to go to all of the very smart people who have helped me with this book and over the years. Thanks, all of you.
You sit on the stage, Steve, do you?
I think so. Yes, yeah. Congratulations to James. Now, in just a moment, I believe this is the interesting bit of the evening. James will be interviewed live on Channel 4 News. In the meantime, I'd very much like to invite Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, the chair of the judging panel, to join me on stage to tell us briefly about the judging process. Jocelyn Bell-Burnell. Phew, the excitement.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, how unanimous was the verdict, Jocelyn?
It was unanimous, but it was still a difficult decision. You'll have seen from the presentations we've had how very articulate all the people are, what wonderful topics they have. It was a hard choice. It was also hard getting from the long list to the short list, I can tell you.
In fact,
been a tough road.
Prompts my next question. The long list, I believe, was 12 books, wasn't it? So but how many submissions did you have in total?
106. 9 boxes of books arrived in my office.
And where are they now?
Still in my office.
I think one question I'm intrigued to ask is did the process give you a feel for what's happening in popular science? Did you get was there any indication of trends, subjects that people were writing about continually? Or?
It was very educational for somebody who's focused on physics and mathematics a lot of her life, because it was incredibly diverse. There were 1 or 2 areas. There were quite a lot of cosmology ones, for instance. Super.
You're a cosmologist yourselves there.
Well, that's close to where I am, yes.
Yes, yeah,
So,
yeah.
you know, I noticed those ones. But although there were some areas where there was more than one book, shall we say, what really was striking was the breadth of this.
Yeah.
Huge, fascinating, and superb to get the chance to have these books and learn from them.
And I suppose, I mean, you yourself, you've edited a collection of poems, I believe,
Yes.
about
Yep.
with scientific subject matter. Did this shortlist inspire you in any way to write your own popular science? Is that something you'd be interested in
I think I'm
doing?
not really disciplined enough to do a lot of writing. I've been supposed to be writing my autobiography for 20 years. I've got the title.
What's the title?
Kites Rise Against the Wind.
Would you like to explain that at all?
The physics?
I think one of the things that sort of interests me is, and James touched on it in his speech, is this, we have the two camps in popular science. We have the scientists writing about subjects they know very well, and people, as James said, with their nose pressed against the glass. One question, why is popular science important? And is it the case, I often wonder, why do distinguished scientists spend their time writing popular science? What are they getting out of it, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. A subsidiary issue that interests me is that until relatively recently, you didn't get any brownie points in academia for writing books like these. That's changing, I'm very glad to say, and I think it should, because it's an excellent way of communicating science to the public, and we desperately need a more scientific literate public. You alluded to the end of the world in 2012. One of the things I've been talking about is whether the world will end. 11:12 a.m., December the 21st this year. It won't. But so many people believe it, and we desperately need to have a more scientifically literate public so that they're not hijacked by people who say, oh, the Earth's magnetic field is going to turn over and that'll be the end of the world, or whatever.
I mean, it does seem to me, I mean, we've got a fantastic audience here this evening and great interest in the prize this year. Yeah. It does seem to be that there is an interest in science awakening among the general public. Is that the impression you're gaining as well? Or?
Yes, that is the impression I'm gaining. I wish it were gaining a bit faster, but I think there is a tendency, yeah.
And what do you think has... do you have any insights as to what's produced that?
Not really. I mean, you can say, oh, it's Brian Cox, but, you know, the Brian Cox phenomenon is relatively recent. So that's a great help, but it may not be it. I don't know.
Well, I think this is certainly a very welcome, extraordinarily welcome change, particularly among the media. And it's wonderful to have Channel 4 News here tonight. I'm just going to go over to Emily and find out if are we going live?
We're about 5 minutes away.
We've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
This is why we asked you to be chair.
Yes, I was going to say, does anyone know any songs? No? Interesting. No. Interesting. Well, perhaps, what should we do? What's that? Well, let's talk a little bit more about this change in scientific culture, which I think is very fascinating. Now, I'm of a generation. When I studied science at school, it really wasn't something that you could gain an enormous amount of social lubrication from. Should we say that?
Yes.
It was
you
not the
being
case.
A female physicist.
Well, this is Yeah.
You try being a physicist.
I'm suddenly understanding your humour. And, and I think one of the fascinating changes that we've gone through over the last decade or so is really moving away from the Mayan prophecy to more evidence-based books, more evidence-based knowledge. And 3 minutes. I wondered if I could just take this opportunity to expound my theory, which is that essentially what you had, I believe, in the 1990s was a kind of everybody living, the 90s and 2000s, everyone living very high on the hog, willing to believe, because, and David, this is where you come in, you see, the economy doing so well, and your fund's always done well in good times and bads, but the economy doing well, I think it gave a certain buoyancy to any kind of idea, and I wondered whether it was the fact that the tide has gone out economically that means that we're suddenly much more interested in evidence-based ideas. David, I'd like to bring you on that. What do you think?
I mean, there's a lot more postdoctoral scientists in the world today than there ever have been before in England and in the world.
Yes.
Vast numbers, twice as many as there were 30 years ago. So for example, it's a golden age of science. There's been a lot of government spending on science has increased a lot in the last 30 or 40 years since the since the post-war era. And the same in America. It's a golden age in America at the moment, isn't it? Because of the Obama administration pouring money.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's about 1 minute, about 45 seconds. I'm just going to sit this minute out. Easy money. Very exciting. I would remind you, ladies and gentlemen, while the interview is taking place, please do be quiet, because just would spoil it. Do you know what I mean? Well done, James. Nail-biting stuff. Good Lord. Tremendously exciting, though, isn't it? I think it's wonderful that so much interest is being shown in the prize this year. Just before we close, what for me certainly has been an extremely enjoyable event. David Harding, I just would like to call on you just to come to the lectern, if you would, and just say a few words before we close the event. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Well, if anybody is helping us to take the sea of information, which a lot of us think that we're drowning in, and turn it into knowledge, then I think you've got to admit it's these guys, really, isn't it? So I just thank them very much for the work they do. And I would like to personally credit Stephen Pinker with making me a more liberal person than I was this time last year. And that's not very easy for a hedge fund manager, I can tell you. So, Winton Capital Management, I'm the founder of. It's an investment management company that bets on the world's financial markets and makes money by so doing. It rather unusually uses scientific research methods and thus wishes to ingratiate itself and align itself, should I say, with scientists who form the preponderance of our recruits and come and work for our company: mathematicians, statisticians, computer scientists, all sorts of large-scale data analysis types come and work for our company, so we want to be known by them. We also wish to retain the sympathy of our investors, for whom we're not doing very well this year, but we usually do very well, as you say. And those investors are those who believe that the scientific method can be brought to bear in a way that can, reason about numbers in a statistical and intelligent way. So what we do is we have all these scientists, and we have a lot of big computer systems, and we analyse this sea of data that comes in, and we try to make some sense out of this data and to bet on the data profitably. Obviously, since we're the sponsor of the prize, it works, and we have betted profitably on it, and it is a wonderful opportunity for us, and I'm most grateful to the Royal Society and to the judges in particular, who have had to read an enormous number of books, and to the author. I'm most grateful to everybody for allowing us to align ourselves with your efforts in a way that reflects very well, hopefully quite well, on us. And finally, I would say that A lot of people say that we recruit scientists, we want to be known by these scientists, and we're poaching these scientists and taking them out of the world of science and onto the dark side. I find a lot of my senior scientific colleagues don't necessarily agree with that. I think it's a good thing that people who are properly trained in rigorous scientific methods and inferential methods are actually participating in things like the financial markets and in politics. And I would argue that we actually need more people from a scientific background to participate in the other areas of life to improve decision-making and to improve the way other institutions outside the scientific world operates, because I think the scientific world operates pretty well already. Thank you very much.
David. Well, thank you, everyone. That concludes tonight's event. I'm sure you'll wish to join me in giving a very warm round of applause for our shortlisted authors. On behalf of the Royal Society and Winton Capital Management, thank you all so much for coming. A very good evening to you all, and happy reading.